Hi, this is Keith from ShipwrightSkills.com, and we're building a ram's horn sled together. This is part 2, so if you haven't watched part 1, please do. This is a sled that I got the idea from primarily Swiss and German sleds from around the turn of the last century, and I thought it'd be a fun way to get out and enjoy the winter. If you want to build one too, you should build one right along with us. So at this point, you have most of the structure of the sled together, so you should take it apart and knock down all the edges. Now that you know where the legs hit the skis and all that, it'll be pretty obvious. And you sand with the grain. You've already sanded to 120, so I just sanded to 150, everything with the grain carefully, and prepared it for dye staining. At this point, you want to think about the deck boards. So they have angles cut on them to match the angle of the ski. So I just brought my sled back over to the lofting, and then I took my bevel gauge and transferred the angle directly off the lofting onto the seat board. Then I laid the seat board onto the lofting and transferred the end cuts onto the seat board, which was, pretty easy. No measuring tape. And then I just set the bandsaw to the angle that I picked up off the lofting. So you could set your jigsaw like that, or you could use a spoke shave, but that's how you get that angle. I didn't want to cut the curved end with the chop saw, so I used a hand saw. Once everything was sanded with the grain to 150, you could stain if you want. I went with stain just because I thought it would be fun. You could just leave it natural if you want. You could also paint it. So at this point now I'm thinking about putting the kevlar on the bottom of the skis. I went with kevlar. You could use steel or bronze or brass or whatever you want. But I just went with kevlar because I thought it would be fun and interesting and light for pulling uphill and durable too. So we're using TotalBoat high performance epoxy, and I'm using a flux brush to wet out the wood. And they always drop little bristles, so you'll see me pulling bristles out. But and then you gotta really work the epoxy into the kevlar to make sure that it's firmly bonded to the wood, that it's not sort of floating on top of it. So this will require a little bit of time you have to set aside to paint all this epoxy on, and then keep coming back over it for a few minutes until it's starting to gel up. And then once that starts to happen, you can take a squeegee to it and sort of really smush it down and take off any excess glue, like that. And then after it cures, within the set amount of time, you can recoat. So if you miss that window, you have to sand it and recoat it. But I built up coats of epoxy over the kevlar to completely fill the weave over the next day or whatever. So with those drying, now you can think about your leg assemblies. So the leg and the thwart that the seat will attach to, and that'll go into the ski that we just did all the mortise and tenon joinery on. To make that glue up easy, I just took pieces of plywood, laid them on the lofting, transferred the lines off the lofting, and then cut myself 2 little jigs to stick in between the legs. I drilled holes in the jigs so that way we could clamp them to the legs. And then I took the whole thing over the lofting and just made sure that everything looked like it was going to work. Then I thought, well, I could just put plastic on top of the lofting and I can see through the plastic and glue up directly on that. So I did that. This is TotalBoat Fixo epoxy. It's a 2-part epoxy, but it comes in a caulking tube and has a special tip that mixes as you squeeze it out. So it's easy to use like caulking, but is a 2-part, very strong 2-part epoxy. It has good gap filling qualities and all that. So you can see I'm not even wearing gloves. It was very clean and easy to work with. So while those are drying, you're going to want to work on the steel reinforcements for the legs. I just went back to the lofting and took the angles from the lofting and a bevel gauge, and I just went right to my vise and just started hand bending this. This is 3/16 steel from the hardware store, nothing special. You could use something heavier. You could use a bender or whatever if you want, but I just wanted to keep it simple, so that's what I did. This is a nice old-fashioned wrench. Actually worked perfect for this job. With just a clamp. You don't need any special equipment. It's fine. And you can see I've got the bevel square there, and I'm just aligning it by eye, making sure that I'm going to have symmetry and that all the angles are good. And I just kept bringing it back and forth to the lofting and setting those angles, and then it was very easy. Once I had all the angles done, then I could cut the ends and mark the bolt holes. So by having the bolt holes marked ages ago, there's no question about where they are. So you just take those off the lofting and go over to your drill press or your hand drill or whatever you do, and drill those holes. The next thing to think about is this tie rod. So by drilling square through the ski, the tie rod will have to be bent at an angle to match the ski. If you visualize it in your head, that's how that would have to work. And then additionally, I wanted a kink in the middle of this tie rod so you could tow it with a rope from, a person could tow it with a rope. And it would be in the center if you wanted it to be. So I started by making the center bend, and then going back to my lofting and figuring out what that angle was. It's right there on the lofting, so it's pretty straightforward. And I bent this one by hand. This is a practice that I just did with a piece of threaded rod from the hardware store, and it was pretty easy. It's a compound bend though, so you want to think about it because you want the part of it to be horizontal and you want part of it to match the skis. Then the stainless steel came, and I did it again in stainless steel. So here I am doing it in stainless steel with just a wrench and your eye, and that's all you need. So, because it's threaded rod, it would be sharp on your gloves and your hands and the rope. I opted to cover it, and I wanted to cover it with heat shrink tubing, which you can get from Jamestown distributors. I got maybe a little too tight of a heat shrink tubing. It was a little hard to get on there, but I got it on there. It was fine. And then the stainless absorbs a lot of heat, so you have to turn the heat gun on it pretty high to get it to shrink on there. But eventually, it makes a nice tight wrap. And then I came in from the other side, and I overlapped the other shrink wrap. So I have a doubled up section in the center where a rope would tow it. Then you have to trim the shrink wrap to the skis on the inside so it doesn't keep the skis from going to the right distance. You got to put a nut and a washer back there, so you want to take your time there, not wreck your shrink wrap that you just did, and get that all set. Now you know that the skis are the right distance apart, and you can use your deck boards to make the inner deck board. You can get fancy with it like this one. I did a little swallowtail kind of thing, and got ready to stain and dye all this stuff. So the deck was, or the seats, are 3/4 of an inch thick. I just chamfered them by hand. This is a real dye stain, not the RIT. It worked awesome, just the same really, but I like a dye stain. I think it looks better than a oil-based stain. This one's super easy to work with, no real fumes to speak of. It looks very consistent when you put it on. It doesn't dry too quickly, and very easy to work with. So while all that stuff is drying, now we're into sort of finish mode. Now we've got to kind of jump around a little bit. So while some of that stuff was drying, I wanted to glue the legs to the skis. So I installed the steel brackets, you can see there, into the assembly. So when I did the glue up, I could drop everything in and know that every angle was right with every leg into the skis. And the tie rod is in, so if you then screw the seat in and bolt that thing on, then there's no, or clamp that thing on, there's no messing it up. And then I just clamped right onto my bench, and you can see the squeeze out of the TotalBoat Fixo epoxy, and that should pretty well fill up that mortise. Then I just cleaned up all the little glue from all the corners, and I'm using a nice bevel gauge there for some reason. But the next thing to do while it's clamped up is to get ready to bore through this end of the ski here and then through the seat board. This is a very important connection. It wants to be centered on the seat board, which is only 3/4 of an inch thick. So you have to think about how you're going to lay that out and transfer everything on there. It's a critical one because you don't want to mess up these parts at this point. So I like to get the thing started with a little tiny drill bit so I know that I'm dead center. And then I just clamp the square on and use a long drill bit from the hardware store that's called an aircraft bit, and use the square to show me that I wasn't going to be going off course. And dead center, both of them first try. So because this hole is straight and the ski is angled, you have to kind of carve away a little bit of wood on the bottom. That's a 2 cherries gouge that I absolutely love. Quick, very easy to do. So there, now you can see that the carriage boat will actually sit flat on wood, even though the ski isn't flat. And you do it on the other side, and it's just as stressful as the first time. But if you do it the same way, and you did a good job on the first one, you'll do a good job on the second one. Then you want to bolt the skis on. So it's pretty easy because the holes are already there. You just want to carefully drill through and make sure that you're not blowing the side of your ski out. So I used a block, I clamped it on there. And then I took these the metal brackets out for finishing. So I carefully labeled each one because they're directional, and the bolt holes and everything might not be perfect. So I know that I won't swap them or get one backwards. And then I wiped the steel down, cleaned the steel up, wiped it all down, and then used a primer and a enamel to hand paint them with just a flux brush. And I wanted to get fancy, so I got out some of my MAC brush pinstriping brushes. And I'm an amateur, but it's a lot of fun, so I just thought this would be a fun place to put a little extra decoration. And if you're, still learning, it's easy. You just wipe it off and put it back on. It's just enamel. It's no big deal. These MAC brushes, they're made in the U.S. They're really nice brushes, actually, handmade and for doing decorative painting, so they won't steer you wrong. Looking pretty good, huh? So I wanted to get the skis pretty cleaned up before I got into finish mode. So I'm grinding off the excess epoxy that I had built up on top of the kevlar. You can see it's not very flat because I just brushed it on, and then I left it for a while. And then now's the time for finishing. So you clean up those skis and get them smooth as could be, because they're skis. So you want them to be as perfect as they can be on the snow as you can get them. So no sharp edges, stuff like that. After cleaning it up, vacuuming it, wiping it down, it's time for sealer. This is TotalBoat Wood Sealer. It's a first coat for underneath varnish, and I did 2 coats back to back. I waited however long it said, and waited till it was tack free, but not past the window, and coated everything twice in a row. And it's very absorbent and thin, and it does drip, so you want to be careful to not have a bunch of drips everywhere. So I used a bristle brush for the subsequent coats. For the real varnish, I used a foam brush, but that's it. So you can see it didn't totally fill the grain, but it made a good start. So then I gave everything a quick scuff the next day with sandpaper and then Scotch-Brite. That's kind of my method. I use a 320 sandpaper and then red Scotch-Brite and try to make everything look like sea glass. That'll give you good adhesion, good tooth for the varnish. So this is the first coat of varnish going down. And you want to just kind of maintain a wet edge. And I used Gleam 2.0 varnish for this project. And it's Gleam. Yeah, it gleams for sure. So after several coats, you'll start to see that the grain really starts to get filled in. It gets very glassy. And at that point, you want to just keep building up coats until you're happy with it. So when I was, time to put the hardware back on. I got all this stainless hardware from Jamestown Distributors, and it looks beautiful. So you want to be careful here mounting everything. This is the end, you know, so do your best job that you can. So the next thing to do is to put a tow rope on it. I wanted to use Amsteel Dyneema. It's very strong. It's a modern fiber. It's just so fun to work with, and it looks really cool, and it's not absorbent and all that good stuff. So I thought it would make a nice tow rope. Unfortunately, my camera's a little out of focus there, but you get the idea. It's a splice that Samson recommends. I got the Samson splicing kit from Jamestown Distributors, and it's really easy if you just follow their instructions to make your own nice splices. This certain splice with this material requires a lock stitch, so I got some sailmaker's twine out and tied a lock stitch. I want to thank TotalBoat and Jamestown Distributors for supplying everything for this build, from the hardware to the paint, the glue, you name it. Go to their websites and get the goods. I'm also working on a build-along comic and a blog on my website at shipwrightskills.com and Shipwright Skills on Instagram.